morning, ladies and gentlemen, and today I'm going to talk about international conflicts past, present, and future. Introduction. Blood alone moves the wheels of history. Martin Luther King. Great historians say that nothing in this world would have been achieved without the blood, sweat, and tears shed by the citizens of this planet we call home. Nevertheless, we always seem to forget the millions of corpses of innocent citizens and soldiers buried underground. We humans always look to the future and are ravenous about the success we may face, but we do not understand the importance of the past which is gone by and the present we are living in. Therefore, in this essay, I want to highlight the significant international conflicts or wars, as we may call it, from the past and the present, which will be looked by future generations as a catalyst to this day and age. Before we start our journey from the past, let's contemplate the meaning of international conflicts. Traditionally, the term international conflict refers to conflicts between different nation states and conflicts between people and organizations in different nation states. Increasingly, however, it also applies to intergroup conflicts within one country where one group is fighting for independence or increased social, political, or economic power. Example, South Sudan, Iraq, and Syria. Now let's start the journey from the sunny beaches of California and the cold winters of Moscow. The Cold War, which happened in the past. Never fight with Russia. On your every strategy, they answer with unpredictable stupidity. Otto von Bismarck. At the end of the World War II, the Cold War had begun. The world was divided between two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, better known as Russia. It would not be a conventional war, the two sides never directly fighting. Instead, be an ideological battle between communism and capitalism, the East versus the West, and its resulting struggle for ideological influence and power. Both sides would stockpile nuclear weapons with questions about how to use, control, and eliminate them before becoming central to the conflict. From Stalin to Reagan to the nuclear arms race to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Berlin War to Vietnam and Korea, this is the story of the Cold War. On the fateful day of June 22, 1941, Germany, led by Hitler, invaded the USSR. Due to the ongoing bloodshed known as World War II, Roosevelt, the then President of the United States, sent supplies for the troops. The Russians felt that the US were degrading their power by helping them. This indirectly started the degradation of the relationship between the USA and Russia. But eventually, the Germans were defeated in humiliating fashion and the World War ended, despite that the US and Russians did not see eye to eye. With one thing, communism. Communism was seen by Russians as the holy scriptures which should be followed by everyone. It was considered the root of evil for the capitalist nations of Europe, the capitalist capital of the US of A. And when Stalin defeated Germany and wanted to implement communism, it was suspected, and since then, suspicion arose between the Western countries and Russia. Hence, the Cold War officially began. After the Second World War, Soviet Russia had manufactured much ammunition and arms. Hence, the USA saw them as a threat and created the atom bomb, hydrogen bomb, and other lethal weapons. Other European countries also took part in the rivalry with Russia, and this divided the world into two halves: the Eastern Bloc, led by the USSR, and the Western Bloc, led by the US. Soviet Russia continued to spread communism in its mass media and wanted to spread it everywhere to encourage the labor revolution. Meanwhile, America held the capitalists against the communists. The difference in the doctrines led to the intensified Cold War situation. After USA bombarded the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Soviet Russia was afraid that they would face similar consequences. Hence, they increased their military and weaponry strategy. When the veto was implemented, Soviet Russia used it to reject any statement that the US made in the UN Council. Hence, the Western countries were insulted by it. After decades of ideological war, the Cold War finally ended. After the Berlin Wall came down, borders opened, and free elections ousted communist regimes everywhere in Eastern Europe. In late 1991, the Soviet Russia dissolved, shutting the Iron Curtain, and the Cold War ended. Cold War resulted in the fear and suspicion between Russia and the USA. It created tension between the nations permanently. There were several alliances solely to increase its intensity. The Cold War resulted in unnecessary expenditure on military power. It created poverty and decreased the living conditions of people. It is a useless and meaningless war that irreparably divided the world. The Cold War disturbed world peace. There is still suspicion between these two nations and the countries that support them. It also created a great demarcation between the first, the second, and third world countries. It resulted in divided humanity, and there is no perpetual peace partially for this reason. Now, let's look at the present Israel Palestine massacre. The greatest victory is that which requires no battle. Sun Tzu. One of the biggest myths about the Israel Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries. That this is all about ancient religious hatreds. While religion is involved, the conflict is mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land. And it only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean, we now call Israel Palestine, had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. It is religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims, Christians, but a small number of Jews who live generally in peace. And it was changed in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, having distinct national identity at the same time, not so far away in Europe. More Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, since Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way, and they saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as the best hope for establishing it. The first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the British and French empires carved up the Middle East. The British taking control of a region called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling in the farming communes, the tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jews' immigration. In response, Jewish militias bound to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, a sectarian violence between Arabs and Jews that grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, establish Palestinian independence, and end the sectarian war violence that the British could not no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and declared independence as Israel, but Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states who just recently won independence themselves declared war on Israel to set up a unified Arab Palestine where all British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process they pushed well past their boundaries under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled vast number of Palestinians from their home, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled and were arrived in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab countries waged war. When it ended, Israel has seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians. the people it had fought for decades. Israel and Egypt signed the US brokered Camp David Accords, and shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of a peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egypt President Anwar Sadat (RIP) was assassinated in part because of outrage against it, but it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. This was when the conflict became a Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut. The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. All of this was happening. Something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people were called settlers, and they made their home in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land of Israel, and some just because housing is cheap. Let's be honest. Often subsidized by the Israeli government, some settlements are cities with thousands of peoples, others are smaller countries and communities deep into the West Bank. These settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off the land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up the Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to even have a independent state. Today, there are several hundred thousand settlers in an occupied territory. Even the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into an intifada, which is the Arabic word for the uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent, and Israel responded with heavy force. A couple of hundred Israelis and over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza who consider the PLO too secular and too compromise minded created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestine must make peace. Therefore, the leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords set up the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. Israeli right protests, peace talks with rallies calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not longer after Rabin signs a second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shot him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how the extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace and keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since negotiations meant to hammer out the final details of peace dragged on for years. And a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe that peace isn't coming and rise towards second intifada. This one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada changed the conflict. Israelis became much more skeptical and that Palestinians will never accept peace. Or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right and the countries build walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They are not trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdrew from Gaza. Hamas gained power but split from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. The state put Gaza under a suffocating blockade and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Banks, most settlements are smothering Palestinians, who often respond with protest, sometimes with violence. So most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, killing lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic, and for the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from the daily lives. In moments of peace, but horrible violence, there's little political will for peace. No one knows where the conflicts go from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses, but everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. That Israel's occupation of Palestinians is too unstable to last, and then unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse. Now let's look into the future. Indo-China War. War is a cowardly escape from the problems of peace. Thomas Mann. From the year 1947, India has been a neighbor of China, and they always seem to have a complex relationship. Although the two behemoths have not fought each other in 6 decades, the circumstances seem to be more tenuous than ever. After the start of the dramatic Russian-Ukraine war, as China may utilize the egregious situation as a justification to attack anyone they want, and India seems to be the no-brainer choice due to a chronicle saga of disputes. Moreover, in 2020, the ubiquitous Chinese apps saw a cash cow for the Chinese economy was struck by the ban hammer by India, its biggest market with a billion users. This did nothing except souring the relationship between the two governments. In addition, both the countries are ready for an all-out bloodbath, with each empire devising clean-cut schemes to annihilate the other. Examples: the Strings of Pearl Diamond Necklace and Kingdom of States are all schemes developed by the force to counteract each other. Nevertheless, in my humble opinion, I feel the Indo-China War is just a catalyst for something bigger, something more hazardous, something which will change the world as we know it. I would like to introduce you to World War III. Conclusion. War brings death, and wounds and pains to both sides. There's nothing harder to accept than the death of those we love, so I believe they could never die, especially those who haven't known war. Nabito Uzumaki. Unlike our past generations, we have never felt war, except when we had to go through the perilous seas of history tests. War brings the grim feeling we face as humans. Hatred. Hatred brings the worst out of us. It nourishes our ego and blemishes our love for each other. Our generation can't be careless. We can't elude war. We need to confront it. We need to confront the governments. We need to elect the people who see peace as a priority and keep their citizens' lives secure. That's why I request our generation to help each other, to help people we have known, to show love to others and kindness to strangers, and bury hatred like the bodies we do not need to bury to release wars. Thank you.